Okay, let's begin. We're studying the life of Joseph. Last week we began his life by looking at the birth of Joseph, which was in chapter 30. We saw that he was born into great turmoil and division. He was also born into great love and favor from his mother and father. He was born with great expectations as the narrative is building him up to be a special child, a child who came from a mother who was barren, just like Sarah and Rebecca before. He was also born, his birth was associated with God's promises. Then in chapter 33, we looked briefly at his childhood, where we get a short glimpse of it when Jacob is coming back from the land of Haran and meets with his brother Esau after a period of over 20 years. And we saw in that brief time, that brief episode, that Joseph is being brought up with great wealth. His father has been blessed by God and has a lot of property and wealth. He's also grew up with favoritism. He is his father's favorite. And then with that came along an undertow of being growing up with resentment from the rest of the family, from his brothers. And as we will see, these are important foundational points in the narrative of Joseph's life that will shape the story and the themes that the biblical writer, who is Moses, is trying to bring out. So this week, in the life of Joseph, we're going to read about a brother rejected, part 1. And we're going to cover just a short passage, Genesis 33:8 through Genesis 37:11. Now, Joseph actually doesn't appear again in the Genesis narrative until chapter 37. But the intervening material shapes the family dynamic in which he's living. He's witnessing and he's part of all of this, but he's in the background. But these points that the author, Moses, is bringing up is going to shape how we read 37. Without these intervening chapters, 37 cannot be understood correctly. So, this morning we're going to look at 2 periods of Joseph's life that lead to his rejection. Okay, the first period of time that will shape Joseph's life is the next 10 years, which spans chapter 33, verse 8, all the way to 37, verse 1. Okay, now the narrative breaks this time period into 3 sections, and they're based on locations. And the first section is their stay in Succoth. And remember last week, where we left off was where Jacob and his family are coming down from Haran to meet Esau for the first time in over 20 years. And so Jacob is here in this area in Gilead, and Esau is coming up from the land of Seir. And the text specifically says that Jacob crosses the Jacob River here at Panuel. That is where he wrestles with God, and God touches his hip, and he's renamed Israel. And Jacob is coming down, and Esau is coming up the major road, and they will meet somewhere in this area. And it's at that time that they are reconciled, and Esau invites Jacob back to his land, which is way down there, and they're up here, all the way down here, which is about 130 miles away. And Jacob tells his brother, yes, go ahead and go on in front of me. I'll catch up. I have animals, I have children, and we have to travel more slowly, so go ahead. We'll travel at our own pace. But as soon as Esau leaves, starts going back down, Jacob goes the opposite direction. And he goes right here to Succoth. So he deceives his brother. He's putting on an air of humility. If you remember last time, he's saying, I'm your humble servant. You are my Lord. I'll do as you say. He gives him gifts. Remember, he's trying to reverse the blessing that he stole. And he's trying to put himself under Esau's authority, but he lies. He has no intention of going to Seir. Jacob is afraid of him. He doesn't trust him. More importantly, he doesn't trust in God's protection. It was God's promise that he would return to the land and that he would keep him safe and he would have descendants and blessings. So here, Jacob is setting an example for his family. And that example is bad. He is presumably also damaging further future relations with his brother Esau. So he settles here in Succoth, and the text says that he pitched his tent, or built a house, and he built shelters. Now when he builds shelters for his animals, that means he plans to stay there for a while. And he does that. He probably stays there a few years before he moves westward, which brings us to our second period, which is their stay near Shechem. So from Succoth, which is here, he travels down this road, crosses the Jordan, and up this way into this area in the plains of near Shechem. This is a strategic city, Shechem. This is a major highway going north and south. Well, there's be a lot of people, merchants traveling. You can easily trade. The area has fertile soil that had great for agriculture and for grazing of sheep, which Jacob has many. The text tells us that he buys a piece of land, and he pitches his tent there, and he constructs an altar. And so by all of that, and he names it the God of Israel, which tells us that he believes that God has blessed him, God has put him here, and it's done. God's promise is fulfilled. He owns a piece of land, he's back in the land, he's there. And so he approves. This is his ideal place to live. But God has other plans. And in chapter 34, we read about his daughter Dinah. This is an actual picture of the area. Mount Gerizim is here, Ebal is here, and Shechem is right in this area. So we read that while they are staying there near Shechem, his daughter goes out to meet the other girls of the city. Now, what is she doing? The text doesn't say. Jewish tradition, according to Josephus, says that she went to join one of their festivals, one of their pagan festivals, to see what they're doing and how they're living. And then when she's there visiting with those girls, the prince, not the king, but the prince, whose name is Shechem, took her and forced himself on her, and then kept her in his home. And then he sought to acquire her as his bride, as his wife. Now, Dinah at this time is probably around 14 or 15 years old. So, when Shechem, the prince, and his father, Hamor, approached Jacob, Dinah's brothers deceive him. And they agree that she can marry him if, and only if, all the males of the city become circumcised. And because Shechem really loves Dinah and really is infatuated with her, he agrees and makes all the men in the city be circumcised. They carried it out immediately. And while they are recovering from this, Simeon and Levi, who are about 19 and 20 years old, they led a group into that city and they killed every male because they were still in pain and they were still recovering. They took all of the women and the children to be their servants. They took all the valuables, all the possessions in the homes, and they took all the animals. So they raided the entire city, and they left the city to become a tomb. So anyone that would come would see nothing but dead bodies of males in the city. So here we see the deception and destruction that they brought. They're following their father's example of putting up a false pretense to obtain what they want. Last time, Jacob put up a false pretense to avoid danger. Here, they're putting up a false pretense to bring danger, to bring harm, to bring destruction. So their unsanctioned retaliation troubled Jacob. Jacob was now afraid that the rest of the tribes, the communities, the cities in that land would join together and attack him. And because he was small in number and they would be greater and thus overpower them. So, and at this time, Jacob was the patriarch, meaning he was the ruler. They weren't supposed to do anything without his say. So they went above his authority without his knowing, and their actions affected the whole entire family. So given their actions, Can Jacob trust Simeon or Levi to lead the family? No. They're showing themselves to be untrustworthy. So at this time, God steps in and tells Jacob, okay, yes, you need to leave. Go down south. Go to Bethel, where you once were, and build an altar there for me. So this leads us to our third period of time, which recording their travels southward. So from Shechem, they travel down the major road and go down towards Bethel. And presumably, this whole situation has upset Jacob. He's troubled. And yet, Jacob obeys God. He hears his voice, he comes down, and he packs up his entire house. He was settled there. He was happy to live there. But he had to move, and he does that. And he travels about 20 miles southward to Bethel. Now Bethel, that's the same place where God appeared to him earlier when he was leaving the land, where he slept on the rock, and he had the vision of the angels going up and down. That's where we get Jacob's ladder from. And that's where God gave him the promises, the covenant promises. And here as well, while he's in Bethel, God appears again and reaffirms the covenant promises. And Jacob needed that because, remember, he was excited to be at Shechem, and he probably thought that that was a fulfillment of God's promises, and then now he has to leave. So God gives him that encouragement, that revelation, when he needed it, confirming the promises are still to come, and that God is going to act. So when Jacob needed to be reminded of God's promises and to be encouraged, God acted. So Jacob does not stay in Bethel, but he continues downwards, and he's moving towards Bethlehem. But while he reaches about Ramah, Rachel goes into labor. And that labor is difficult, and she dies. She dies soon after she gives birth to Benjamin. So Joseph loses his mother when he's about 15 years old. The narrative tells us that they continue down southward towards Bethlehem, and while they are on their way and around Bethlehem, Reuben has relations with Bilhah, which is Rachel's maidservant, his father's wife, which brings great shame, which brings further division within the family, because he has wronged her and wronged the family. And the text says that Jacob knew about it, which brought sadness to him upon sadness. And now he can't trust Reuben either. Reuben is the eldest. He's the one in whom the blessing, the inheritance, the land is supposed to go to. And now he can't trust him. 1 Chronicles actually says, now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he is not enrolled in the genealogies according to his birthright. So he lost the blessing there. And finally, in their trip southward, they finally reach the area of Hebron. And this is where Isaac and Rebekah live. So Jacob is finally reunited with his parents. And the grandchildren finally meet their grandparents. And while they are there, Isaac dies. And he's 180 years old. And the text tells us that Jacob and Esau bury him. Now, at this time, remember, Jacob had the birthright of Esau, and he had his blessing. The blessing that was supposed to be given to the firstborn. So at this time, Jacob inherits all his father's property, his servants, everything. So this scene concludes with the words, now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. So he's in this area. And this first verse in chapter 37 functions as a conclusion to the story of Jacob. And here we see the promises of God mostly fulfilled. The promises from Genesis 28, 13 through 15, that God gave him in Bethel, we see a partial fulfillment. Number one, he is in the land. He doesn't own the land yet. That part is unfulfilled. But he's in the land. He has the beginnings of a vast descendants. He has a lot of sons and daughters. He's given a privileged position of blessing. He has all of his own wealth, and then plus he's just inherited all his father's. He was returned safely, and he did return to the land. So most of God's promises were fulfilled. But he still waited. So here, at the end of this section, and what the next 10 years communicated to us, is that the number 1, number 2, number 3 eldest sons were shown to be untrustworthy and didn't have the ability to lead the family. They would not inherit that blessing or that position. And Joseph, living at this time, number 1, he saw that his father did worship God. He built altars and he did have a relationship with God. But he also acted in deceit to get out of danger. He saw his sister being hurt. He saw his brothers lie and commit murder. He saw his mother die and his father suffer. He saw his other brother act immorally, which further divided the family. And then he saw his grandfather die. So in a real sense, we see the fall of a family. The family just goes through one sadness to the next, which contrasts for us in the narrative the rise of Joseph. Chapter 37, verses 2 through 11, where we'll spend the rest of our time. And this is the second episode. In this episode, it begins with Joseph being loved and hated. So let's read the verse. Verse 2 says, "These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to his father." Okay, the first line, these are the records of the generations of Jacob. We are now moving on from Jacob to his sons. The narrative will now focus on the activities of Jacob's sons. And at first, character is obviously Joseph. It's anchored in time. He's 17 years old, and he's acting and working as a shepherd. He's out in the fields with his brothers. And it says that he was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth. Now he's already told us that it's 17, so that the word for youth there it's not communicating his age, it's communicating his position. That word can mean a servant or a helper. So it's showing that Joseph's status out pasturing is the lowest. So another way we can word this is to say that Joseph, when he was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers, and he was a servant. He was a helper. He was a gopher. He didn't have any position of authority. He was at the bottom of the totem pole, or bottom of the ladder. And the text says he was there along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Now realize, we're the sons of Leah. They're given special status. They're the ones in charge. The children of the maidservants, they're viewed as being distinct, possibly lower. They're also younger, and Joseph is along with them, not with the sons of Leah or Rachel, but he is thought of and viewed as being below. Now in scriptures, shepherding is viewed oftentimes metaphorically for ruling. For leading people. And here, it's saying that Joseph brought about a bad report about them to his fathers. So, it implies that they are not shepherding well, and thus they would not lead well. They would not lead the family well. So Joseph gives a bad report. Now this is not tattletaling. He's not going back and starting trouble. The sons were entrusted with the family's livelihood. And under Jacob's instructions, they, all 10 of them, in some way, the text doesn't tell us, in some way, they were not carrying out their duties properly. And then so here, we see Joseph is loyal and obedient to his fathers over against the peer pressure of his brothers who are in rebellion. He's not going along with them. It's the idea of the brothers, when they were out of the sight of the father, then I'll do what we want. And that's the idea there. And Joseph is being faithful to his father and gives that report that they were doing wrong, wicked, evil. Notice that none of the other 10 gave their report or stood up. Only Joseph did, which shows that Joseph alone is trustworthy, that the rest of them were disobedient or rebellious against their father. And thus, Joseph is the only one whom Jacob can trust. In light of this, these events portray Joseph as being faithful to his father in the little things, even though it's going to cause him harm and he's going to be unpopular with his brothers. He is faithful and he's obedient. He's proving to be someone in whom greater things can then be entrusted. So do you see that principle? He's faithful with the little, so we'll know that he will be faithful with the big things. Moving on to verse 3, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a very colored tunic." Now the phrase there, the son of his old age, that's not saying that Joseph was born when Jacob was old, because they were all born within the 7-year period. And in fact, Benjamin was born later. So it's not saying that, but it's either saying one of two things. The old age can either refer to Jacob, and basically he's saying now that Jacob is growing older, Joseph is his number one son. It's in Joseph that he looks towards to replace him when he dies, to lead the family. It's Joseph whom he's grooming. If the old age refers to Joseph himself, then it would mean that Joseph was considered to be wise, to be a son as if he is an older son. In his old age, has wisdom of age. The ancient translations take it either way. Some take it one way, some take it other. Either way, the point's the same. Joseph is being viewed as being the one in whom Jacob will set as his heir. The one who will lead the family, the one that will have the authority and the blessing. And so, he made him a vari-colored tunic. Now, that word is very rare in Hebrew, and the meaning is uncertain. It can mean one of three things. Number one, it can mean it was many-colored, which the Greek translation has, and also some of the Aramaic translations. It can mean that it was long-sleeved, and long this way, going to the ankle. It could also mean that it was richly embroidered, showing special craftsmanship and great expense. Now, unfortunately, there are not a lot of pictures in this time to show us what it would look like, but there is one. In a tomb of an official named Khnumhotep in Egypt that dates to 1890, which is, 1890 is during the life of Joseph in the 12th dynasty, there's a wall painting. And on that wall painting, among other things, is this group of people. It's a family of West Semites, whose leader, it's written, his name is Abshah, which scholars say it's a typical Amorite name, which identifies that whole group as nomads from Canaan. Specifically in the painting, they're metal workers. They're merchants selling wares, working with metal. So let's zoom in, and this is what it looks like. These are the women here, the same women here. So this is behind the women, this is in front of them. Look at the clothing. Look at the stripes, the colors. There's beautiful colors and tunics. This would not be their everyday wear. their everyday wear would be like these people. Do you see how it's kind of off-white here and here? That's what normal people wore both during the day and to go to sleep. That's what they wore all the time. The fact that these people have multicolored outfits shows that this is the dress-up clothing. This is business attire. This is something showing that they are wealthy merchants. And in the painting on the tomb, there's vivid reds, blues, and blacks. And to take a closer look, these are the women's clothing. You see all the intricate patterns. But look at this. This is the most elaborate male clothing. And so this is the closest thing that we have to, so you can visualize what Joseph's coat may have looked like. Now, if you saw a person with a coat like this standing among a group of people with coats that are off-white, what would that communicate to you? Immediately you would communicate, that's the guy in charge. That's the guy that has authority. That's the guy who has wealth. And that's what that coat did. The coat that Jacob gave showed the whole family that Joseph was loved by Jacob more. It showed that he received Jacob's favor in this very costly gift. And in conjunction with that, it showed that Joseph's status in the family was son number one. He was the one in authority. He was the one in whom Jacob intended to be his heir. To the one whom Jacob trusted. And thus implication is the others weren't. Now remember in the text, his brothers viewed him how? As a youth, as a helper, as a servant, not as their authority, not as their leader, not as the leader of the family. So how would the brothers react to this? Verse 4 says, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. They hated his own brother as an enemy within their own household. Does this remind you of one brother who does well and another brother getting jealous and getting angry and hating, and that time that brother kills him? Cain and Abel, very similar. It shows a pattern of this happening. It foreshadows for us what may happen. The text here says that they could not speak to him on friendly terms. The word for friendly terms there, it comes from the root of shalom, peace. They could not speak to him in peaceful terms. They couldn't make peace with him because they were so angry and so jealous. And that foreshadows coming hostility. So here we see at the end of verse 4 that Joseph is loved, but he's also hated. He's loved and granted great honor within the family, but that also comes with a price of being hated and being envied by his brothers. So then in verse 5 through 11, we see Joseph the dreamer. And in verses 5 through 8, we see Joseph's first dream. Verse 5 reads, then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. Now, dreams at that time were recognized as being divine communication. This wouldn't be any old daydream, but these kinds of dreams would be more vivid, they would be unusual, and they would be definitely would make an impact on you unlike any other dream. And the question is, if Joseph had a dream, who experienced it? Only he did. So would his brothers believe it? So since in the text, we're not told by the author, by Moses, there's no mention of God. That God gave it, or God visited Joseph, or God, nothing. There's no God. We're just told that he had a dream. And with the culture, we can assume that sometimes it was from God. Sometimes it wasn't. So we, the reader, are left uncertain, and we're left wondering. And only through the course of the narrative is that answer going to be revealed to us, whether it was from God or not. So, the text says that the brothers hated him even more. Now that phrase there is a wordplay in Hebrew. it literally says they added to hate him more. And the word for added, the verb, I'll say it out loud. This is what it's transliterated into. It's Yosephu. Yosef. Do you remember Joseph's name means added? So whereas Rachel named him added, that God may add to her another son, there's a play on words here because Joseph's being, at this point, God is adding to him a dream. The brothers are adding hatred towards him. They're growing in their hatred. Now verse 6 goes into more detail as far as all of this. This is a summary verse. And verse 6 says, and he, Joseph, said to them, his brothers, please listen to this dream which I had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up, and also stood erect, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. Parentheses, can you believe that? This is a dream. It was an unusual experience. If you had an experience like this, you would want to share it. Who is he going to share it with? Well, his brothers. That's whom he's spending the most of his time with. So it was very normal for him to share this. There's no indication in the text that he's speaking this arrogantly or anything else in a negative fashion. He's viewed in a positive light here. Now, it says in the dream that they were binding sheaves in the field. And you're saying, well, wait a second, they're shepherds. Well, number one, it's a dream. So it may or may not be what they actually literally always do, but it probably is. They probably do, at certain times, grow crops. We have an example in Genesis 26:12 of Isaac sowing and reaping in the land. And Isaac was a shepherd and had sheep. So it's very likely that they could be doing that. They do that normally as well. But here, it's a dream. And what does that dream mean? It's very interesting that the brothers have no problem interpreting the dream. Right? Verse 8 says, and then the brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Notice the brothers, they focus on the one point of bowing down, of showing humility and submission to the one in authority, their little brother. And notice their rhetorical questions. It's in parallel, Hebrew parallelism, saying the same thing. Do you notice the irony there? Because the words that they are speaking is exactly what's going to happen. Yes, they will actually bow down to him. And yes, they will. Joseph will reign over them. So they're focusing on the bowing part. And they don't quite understand the sheaves. Now we see the sheaves and we know the end of the story. So we see that is foreshadowing for us the issue of grain in which Joseph will provide for his brothers. So the concluding words there, they repeat exactly verse 5. And thus it shows that this is the reason why they hated him even more. And this is the third time in the text that it says his brothers hated him. It shows great emphasis. And it's an appalling emphasis. It's a surprising emphasis. Well, how can brothers in the same family hate each other? That is not characteristic of the people of God. And in fact, anyone who hates his brother, the one in his own family, doesn't know God. Because God is love. God is characteristic of love, and his people follow his character. So notice the last part of the text adds to it. It's not just they hated him even more, but then it gives a reason for his dreams and for his words. So when it says for his dreams, it's for the divine favor that God has shown in giving Joseph this dream. And for his words, the content of those dreams, that he will rule over them. Now note as well, the word dream is plural. Dreams. It conveys here kind of a summary verse already of what's about to happen, because that leads us right to Joseph's second dream, which is in 9 through 11. Verse 9 says, now he had still another dream, and related it to his brothers, and said, Lo, or behold, I have had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And he related to his father and his brothers. So here he tells his fathers as well. So this second dream would confirm the content of the first dream. And they're both communicating images that communicate the same thing, the same story, the same message. And that message is a divine message. And in fact, in Genesis 41:32, when Pharaoh has two dreams, Joseph says that by the second dream, the truth of the dream is established by God. Because thus God is giving two witnesses of the events that are about to happen or going to happen soon. So the dreams of the sheaves were earthly. The second dream is greater, it's grander, it's cosmic. It's on a cosmic level. Just like the sheaves earlier were the brothers, here the stars are obviously the brothers, the 11 brothers. And because there are 11, it includes Benjamin as well. And thus, obviously, it corresponds to the sheaves. But the second dream adds a sun and a moon. And again, his brother and his fathers have no problem interpreting this dream. Continuing on in verse 10, it says, And his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you've had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come and bow ourselves down before you to the ground? The father, Jacob, reacts by rebuking him. The word for rebuking there in Hebrew is an onomatopoetic device. The word is gah. So it communicates anger and disgust. It's a sharp, loud word that is aimed for putting an end to the undesirable activity. It's in English we might just say stop or enough, harsh, loudly, to kind of startle someone. But in Hebrew is gar. It kind of almost sounds like growling. So Joseph, who is used to favor and love of his father, is sharply reprimanded here. And again, the offense that earlier the brothers had and here his father has is on that authority, the position of bowing down. Here, Jacob clearly sees himself as the sun and clearly sees his mother as the moon. Now, wait a second. Rachel died. So what is this talking about? We know that this is after Rachel died because the 11th star is Benjamin. In that time period, this is showing us that Leah has now become his mother. Leah has stepped into that role and is acting as his mother, which, by the way, as a side note, would probably add more problems with the other brothers. More animosity. So the author then informs us that his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this saying in mind. His brothers were jealous. This brings, in conjunction with the hatred, jealousy. They were angry at Joseph's character and his good fortune, the divine favor shown to him, and the possible future blessing of authority and ruling. And that anger at those realities that were coming to him instead of them was destroying their relationship. They were envious at the blessings that he was receiving. Now, the question I have for you and for us is, will anger and jealousy ever accomplish anything good? If your brother was successful in something, is getting angry at him or jealous of him going to help you or help your brother or help the family in general? Absolutely not. So just on a very logical level, it's foolish. But why do we sometimes get jealous or envious and angry about it? Well, it's because we expect more. We expect equality. We expect the same treatment. We expect everything the same. But we saw in this narrative the author was clear to show us how the sons were all unfaithful and rebellious, and only Joseph was faithful. And so his godly conduct, his obedience, put him in a position of authority. God granted him that blessing, although it's coming with much hostility as well. And so, what do we do if we're jealous or angry with someone else because of jealousy, and we're starting to feel that hatred? And by the way, as we're going to see next week, keeping that hatred and that jealousy, that will lead to acting out against it, acting out from it, against the other person, bringing harm. So we want to make sure that we don't continue in that. But what happens if we are jealous? What do we do? Well, we need to take that desire for wanting what we don't have and act in a way to get it. Not putting someone else down, but use it in our own hearts and minds and souls to encourage us to do better, to do good. It's very similar to what God told Cain when he said, do what is right, and you will do well. But if you continue, sin is crouching at the door, and it wants to be master over you. You could do it God's way, of if you see your brother being blessed or succeeding, well, let that be used for you as an example, something to encourage you and to strive you to work harder and to say, yeah, I want to be just like that, and use them as an example to follow. But if you sin, that will hold mastery over you. You will go down further and further. So when we feel that anger and that jealousy, we need to be humble as God's people and follow godly examples. So that's the brothers. The brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept his saying in mind. Now, although Jacob rebuked him, because it was that whole concept of his own father bowing down to his son, that's culturally completely unacceptable and appalling. But Jacob had dreams of God, so he knows about these dreams, and he understands that God does communicate through dreams. And he doesn't understand Joseph's dream, but he knows that God can do it because he's experienced it. So he's holding those thoughts, this concept, this story, to see if it comes to pass, and thus whether it's really from God. And that concludes the rise of Joseph. So although Joseph is granted a position of favor in the family and shown divine favor in his dreams, Joseph is left isolated. His brothers hate him. Now, whether they're visualizing it and it's clear, or whether they are putting a front up, they despise him. And it's getting worse as the days go on. And now his own father rebukes him. So he's left at odds with everyone in his whole world. So surely, though, because Joseph is obedient and he is a man of character, surely that things are going to get better, as we'll probably see in the next text. Right? So we'll see that things don't get better. So let's go now and move that to applications. Number one, although Jacob led his family in worship of Yahweh, he exhibited a bad example in deceiving his brother Esau. He presented himself as a servant, but lied to avoid potential danger. Jacob does not trust in God's hand of protection. Although Dinah was mistreated, this does not justify Simeon and Levi deceiving Shechem and Hamor and murdering all the men of the city. They brought danger to the whole family and shame to the name of God. They acted with authority that did not belong to them, which disqualified them in their father's eyes from leading the family. Number three, although Jacob had settled near Shechem, believing that this was God's promised location, it wasn't. And when Jacob needed to be reminded of God's promises and to be encouraged, God acted. Number four, Reuben sinned in taking his father's wife, which disqualified him in his father's eyes from leading the family. Number five, Joseph was faithful in the little things, even though it would cause him harm, proving himself trustworthy in greater things. And number 6, the jealousy of Joseph's brothers led them to hate their own brother, viewing him as an enemy. This behavior demonstrates their lack of faith in Yahweh, and thus their ungodly character, because anyone who hates his brother does not know God.